The House will come to order. Calendar for the day. The first bill on the calendar for the day is Senate File 1563. The clerk will report the bill.
Senate File number 1563, number 1 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to public safety, the first engrossment.
The member from Mahnomen, Representative Green, to introduce your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Senate File 1563 is a bill that will allow federally recognized Indian tribes to access the BCA for background checks. The tribes right now are required to do background checks for family violence protection programs, Indian child protection, volunteers in schools, Head Start, daycare, and adult day services, and health care. The bill simply, if it's on a volunteer basis, it will allow the BCA to do the background checks and the tribes will pick up the cost. It's a pretty simple bill.
There are no amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, Senate File number 1563.
Third reading. Further discussion on the bill. The member from Hennepin, Representative Allen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in support of this bill. This is something that the tribes have expressed no concern about, in so much as participation is voluntary, and this is something that a need of the tribes, because the performance of private vendors has been spotty, and so the tribes have no issue with the customary charges that will be imposed for this service. So, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member from Carleton, Representative Sundin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to rise to thank Representative Green for bringing forth this bill. This is very important for the child protection services in the tribal entities throughout Minnesota. It also adds a lot of value, and it'll bring integrity and accuracy to the background checks for elective offices in the tribal nations. So thank you, Representative Green.
The member from Mille Lacs, Representative Erickson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I too want to rise in support of Representative Green's bill. It is very important that we have this ability for our tribal governments to use the BCA for background checks in a variety of the services that they provide. And so this has been a long time in coming, and I'm very appreciative that Representative Green has brought this forward. Thank you.
Any further discussion on Senate File 1563? Any further discussion? Seeing none, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will close the roll. There being 129 ayes and 0 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. The next bill on the calendar for today is House File 1725. The clerk will report the bill.
House File number 1725, number 2 on the calendar for the day, an act relating to state government.
The member from Dakota, Representative Christensen, to introduce your bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. House File 1725 allows Minnesotans to file forms with the Office of Administrative Hearings via email as opposed to only via mail and fax.
There are no amendments at the desk. The clerk will give the bill its third reading.
Third reading, House File number 1725.
Third reading. Discussion on House File 1725. The member from Hennepin, Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if Representative Christensen will yield to a question.
He most certainly will. Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Christensen, do you know, is there a fiscal note on your bill? I'm assuming that this will cost the Office of Administrative Hearings some money to either upgrade their computer systems, or it will save money by decreasing the amount of time that they need to spend answering mail. And I'm wondering if you have a fiscal note.
Representative Christensen.
Mr. Speaker, members, the cost of this bill to the Office of Administrative Hearings is fiscally neutral. As far as our constituents, it will actually save them a little bit of money in a trip to FedEx and paying to FedEx their forms to OAH.
Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if Representative Christensen would yield for another question.
He will yield. Representative Hortman.
Representative Christensen, I'm wondering if you took your bill to the Civil Law Committee, if you discussed the data practices implications. When individuals had their cases before the Office of Administrative Hearings, if they faxed their filings in, their work history and sometimes their medical history would be lying around on a fax machine. Did you bring your bill to Representative Scott's committee and discuss that issue?
The member from Dakota, Representative Christensen.
Mr. Speaker, yes, this was vetted by the Civil Law Committee.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Hortman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Christensen, it's a great bill. I hope people vote yes.
Any further discussion on House File 1725? Seeing no further discussion, the clerk will take the roll on the bill. The clerk will close the roll. Franson votes aye. There being 130 ayes and 0 nays, the bill is passed and its title agreed to. Report from the Committee on Rules and Legislative Administration.
Peppin from the Committee on Rules and Legislative Administration, pursuant to Rules 1.21 and 3.33, designates the following bill to be placed on the calendar for the day for Tuesday, April 21st, 2015, and establishes a pre-filing requirement for amendments offered to the following bill. House File Number 4. Peppin from the Committee on Rules and Legislative Administration, pursuant to Rules 1.21 and 3.33, designates the following bill to be placed on the calendar for the day for Wednesday, April 22nd, 2015, and establishes a pre-filing requirement for amendments offered to the following bill. House File Number 843.
Motions and resolutions.
McNamara moved that House File Number 846.
Oh. There are copies of the non-controversial motions at the House desk and online. If there's no objection, we'll take action on these motions first. Hearing no objection, the motions prevail.
McNamara moves that House File Number 846 be recalled from the Committee on Civil Law and Data Practices and be re-referred to the Committee on Ways and Means.
The member from Dakota, Representative McNamara, to introduce your motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is my bill. It's the Omnibus Environment and Natural Resources Finance Bill. I've spoken with the Chair of Civil Law, and she does not hear the section that pertains relating to the penalty waiver. It's not new. It just expands an existing program.
The member from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask for a roll call on the motion.
A roll call has been requested. Seeing 15 hands, there will be a roll call. Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I think we actually made the right decision last Friday when the Civil Law Chair accepted this. This provision in the bill that sends it to Civil Law relates to penalties, and that's what I said on Friday. In addition, there is a new penalty for the AIS affirmation provision in there, a $25 penalty. So there is a new penalty, and there is the provision relating to penalties. So Chair McNamara mentioned that there's no new penalty, but there actually is one in there. That being the case, they're also in the provision that was not a bill, a Fabian amendment that was adopted in the committee relating to penalties, and this should go to Civil Law on Friday. I think the right decision was made, and that should be where it stays.
The member from Dakota, Representative McNamara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Representative Hansen, in regards to the AIS, the $25 penalty, actually, it is covered under current law. Unfortunately, under current law, it was up to a $500 penalty if you didn't sign your boat license. We clarify that not signing that is a $25 civil fine, so it's not a new penalty.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I think Representative McNamara just answered the question for everybody that there is a very significant change in this bill. And I would also remind members that we voted unanimously last week at the recommendation of the chair of the Civil Law Committee that it needed to go to her committee. So, members, I don't know why we're changing course now. I would also have a point of parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Speaker.
State your point of parliamentary inquiry.
So this bill is now sitting in the in a policy committee, the Civil Law Committee, and it's my understanding that if a bill has not met deadline, which this bill has now not met because it's sitting in a civil law in a policy committee at the unanimous vote of this body, doesn't the bill have to go to Rules Committee before it can be moved to any other committee?
Representative Thiessen, technically I think you are correct. However, this body can certainly overrule and move that bill at its discretion. If this body determines it does not need to be in that committee, I think that's appropriate. So I would certainly respect the opinion of this body. If this motion passes, they'll determine that this bill doesn't need to be in that committee. Representative
Mr. Speaker,
Thiessen.
point of parliamentary inquiry.
State your point of parliamentary inquiry.
So is that a vote of the majority of the body, or we'd actually be suspending our rules, right, to move it to not have to go through the Rules Committee? So would we need actually a 90-vote margin to be able to suspend the rules to overcome the rule? I mean, this is not just moving a bill from committee to committee. This is actually skipping one of our rules in a resolution we adopted, which seems to me would require a vote of 90, would require 90 votes.
If we were pulling the bill, Representative Thiessen, to the floor, I think you might be correct, but we're still just moving it from one committee to the next, and that requires just 68 votes. Representative Thiessen.
Okay. Well, Mr. Speaker, it seems to me that we're violating any number of our rules at this point. We are taking a policy committee that is past deadline and moving it to the Ways and Means Committee without going through the Rules Committee. We voted unanimously at the recommendation of the chair of the Civil Law Committee on Friday that this bill should go to the Civil Law Committee for a hearing, which I think can be heard tomorrow morning, which is not that much of a delay. Further, Representative McNamara admitted when he stood up that there is a significant change in this bill related to civil fines and penalties. So, members, we know all of these things as facts. Hopefully, at some point in this session, we will unite together and decide the rules actually matter in this body for transparency. We adopted the rules for a reason, and that you'll vote appropriately. I don't hold up much hope, I have to say, based on the experience we've had over the course of this session so far, that you'll actually vote to uphold the rules when they don't necessarily serve your exact interests. I imagine you're going to vote to bend the rules in order to serve your interests, because that's what you've done all session. But I would encourage you this time to follow the recommendation of Chair Scott, who said last Friday that she needed to see this bill. She was right, and we should move forward and vote no on this motion.
The member from Anoka, Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, Representative Thiessen, and members. I was under the false assumption when Representative Hansen brought this forward, the motion forward last Friday, that there was there were new penalties, there were new things in statute to look at, and that just wasn't the case. And so, members, we do not need to hear this bill in civil law. There is no change to what was an existing statute. So I would urge a green vote on this motion. Thank you.
The member from Hennepin, Representative Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker and members. I would just point out as well that because the committee did not take action on this, it does not need to does not trigger a need to come back to rules.
The member from Ramsey, Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative McNamara yield to a question?
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative McNamara, number one, this didn't come through civil law, so I'm not completely familiar with this. And second, I wasn't here on Friday when apparently this all erupted. So I'm trying to learn this on the fly. But you had just stated that there are no changes except for reducing a fine, and I'm looking at lines 4521 to 4522. Can you tell me what those lines are doing, what you're doing in those?
The member from Dakota, Representative McNamara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Lesh, I'm going to try and answer. I don't have the bill in front of me. I was referencing the AIS penalty. Are you talking about the AIS penalty when I talked about the reduction in the fine?
Ms. Speaker. And,
Representative Lesh.
Representative McNamara, yes, I believe it. It says, for failing to have aquatic invasive species affirmation displayed or available for inspection as provided in sections 86B401.
The member from Dakota will yield. Representative McNamara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Lesh, that's not why the bill got referred on Friday. But to answer your question, if you wouldn't have signed that form under current law, you would be subject to a fine of up to $500. We clarified that not signing that form now will only be a fine of $25. That form that you signed is the third page of your boat license, and it has multiple purposes, including this AIS function. But under current law, not signing that is subjected to a fine of up to $500. Only one person since 1997 has been charged and convicted of that, and I can't remember what their penalty was, but it was somewhere between 0 and 500.
Well, Mr. Speaker.
Representative Lesh.
Would Representative McNamara yield to another question?
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative McNamara, I'm also looking at other provisions on page 86 that have exceptions spelled out, specific exceptions to civil or administrative enforcement action. Can you explain to me why it is that when there are exceptions laid out of people once having to undergo civil enforcement action, now they wouldn't under your bill, why that has no place in civil law?
The member from Dakota, Representative McNamara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Lesh, the section you're referring to on page 86 are a duplication of current law.
Representative Lesh.
Mr. Speaker, and Representative McNamara, Mr. Speaker, would Representative McNamara yield to another question?
He will yield. Representative Lesh.
Okay, Representative McNamara, where else in law is it duplicated?
Representative McNamara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Lesh, that would be in the MPCA's audit program.
Okay. Mr. Speaker,
Representative Lesh.
Representative McNamara, the legislature doesn't take agency administrative actions. We change statutes. So if you're telling me the agency has its own administrative action and that's taken care of by them, therefore they're already doing it, so any change in statute shouldn't implicate a change in law, I take exception to that. We are the body that changes laws for the state of Minnesota, not the MPCA. Maybe, Mr. Speaker, if Representative McNamara would yield to another question, is there another place in statute where this is duplicated?
He will yield. Representative McNamara.
Yes.
Representative Lesh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
He will yield.
McNamara, if he would yield to another question, can you tell me where? And I see he was just handed a piece of paper from Representative Scott, so I'm assuming he can cite it without due delay.
Representative McNamara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we might be able to speed it up, Representative Lesh. So, you're looking at the electronic copy, and I didn't bring my computer. I think I'm looking, if you go to 114C.24 and then go to subdivision 3 exceptions, I think you'll see the exact same language in current law there.
Okay. Well, Mr. Speaker, Representative McNamara, I don't have that, and I don't see the same language. And if it already exists, I don't understand why it would need to be duplicated. And that is a perfect reason of why this should be examined in civil law. When I was civil law chair, there were people who would explain to me that this is duplicative. We do it somewhere, and I'd go and read it and find out, no, it's actually not duplicative because it's referring to a different instance. So, Mr. Speaker and members, this is starting to become a pattern, and I don't really understand why we're doing this. It started with your first bill you brought up, House File 2, that you violated the rules on only 2 weeks after you passed your rules. We clearly violated those, and when I asked the author why we're skipping civil law, the author was nervous. Well, you know how it is in civil law, we're a little nervous about that. That's not a good enough reason to skip civil law. If there's a provision in there, and maybe you made a mistake, and maybe you tripped up and you missed civil law when you should have gone there. Well, you're in the majority. You can modify it. You can go to Rules Committee if you want to solve it, but it doesn't change the fact that these bills can't skip the critical committees, because that's how we end up making bad law. And I really hope that we don't end up having to go back and fix this next year because we make a bad decision again. But this, as I can count, House File 2, there was another instance that I don't have in front of me that was a month ago where we skipped civil law with a provision that clearly should have gone there. And now we're doing it again from an instance on Friday where you said, yeah, you're right, it should have gone there. And then there was a quick huddle and you decided, oh boy, no, we can't go to civil law now. We'll find a way to skip it because you're in the majority. You can't keep doing this. That's how we make bad law, and it also shows a bad hand. So, members, I would ask members to support the motion. I'm sorry, to oppose the motion. Thank you.
Further discussion, the gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think Representative Lesch did a pretty good job.
Further discussion. Representative Yaruso.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Scott yield to a question?
Representative Scott will yield. Representative Yaruso.
Thank you. So we've been told that what this provision does that we've been discussing is to lower an administrative penalty. And civil law is not interested in that, considering that a trivial change. So I'm still trying to learn the ins and outs of this game. So am I to infer from this that in the future, if there's some amendment on the floor or anything like that that would have the effect of reducing an administrative penalty for something, that Civil Law Committee would consider that trivial and not be interested in having heard that?
The lady from Anoka, Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Representative Yaruso. Once again, the motion that was made on Friday, I accepted under a false presumption that this changed the basic statute. It does not need to come to civil law.
Mr. Speaker.
Representative Yaruso.
Would Representative Scott yield again?
She will yield. The lady from Ramsey.
Representative Scott, I couldn't tell if that was a yes or a no.
The lady from Anoka, Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was an explanation for the motion on Friday.
The lady from Ramsey.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would Representative Scott yield again?
She will yield. The lady from Ramsey.
Representative Scott, I did not ask about the motion on Friday. I asked a direct yes or no question, and I still have not been able to tell whether well, actually, I have not gotten an answer. I can tell that now. So I'm still interested in a yes or no. Am I to infer from the discussion today that if there were an amendment or a bill or so on in which the penalties were reduced, administrative penalties were reduced, that would not be a matter that you as the chair of the Civil Law Committee would consider to be under your purview?
The lady from Anoka, Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Representative Yaruso, once again, this doesn't change statute. This doesn't change statute. The bill was, when the motion was made on Friday, was made in a very almost deceptive manner to make it sound like this was something, changing something in statute. And so that's the origins of this whole discussion.
Mr. Speaker?
The lady from Ramsey, Representative Yaruso.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, it's quite clear from the level of the lack of an answer. I'm not going to get an answer to my question. We have before us a bill whose purpose, of course, what we're doing is changing statute. And if it, so I don't understand that entire line. So I can only be left to conclude that we are setting some kind of precedent here that, this is not the kind of thing that civil law is interested in if we're going to reduce penalties for things, and I would encourage members to see if there are any other opportunities. Thank you.
The gentleman from Dakota, Representative Hansen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm not going to rise under a point of order. I'm just going to rise under disappointment. Chair Scott, I've been here 10 years, and to have my integrity questioned there. The words that I said that you accepted were relates to penalties. And this provision relates to penalties. And we have other pieces in here that relate to penalties. And to accuse me of deceiving you just isn't true, and you know it.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will Representative Scott yield for a question?
She will yield. Leader Thiessen.
Thank you. Representative Scott, when you were asked to make this decision, did you actually go and read the language for yourself before you actually made the decision? Because that's usually the best way to proceed before you make a decision.
The leader from Anoka, Chair Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And members, I would apologize. I will say that it wasn't deceptive. It was just not very clear in the way that Representative Hansen presented. And it was leading in one specific direction.
Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Representative Scott yield for a question?
She will. The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Did you read the language before you advised the body about what the language actually did?
Chair Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The motion was brought to me that morning.
Mr. Speaker?
The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Maybe this is a point of parliamentary inquiry. What time did we meet last week, last Friday?
State your point of parliamentary inquiry. What time did we meet last Friday? It was 10 o'clock a.m.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Representative Scott, I take it that you actually didn't read the language before you advised the body on how to vote on the motion. It seems very clear, and you know, the fact is, Representative McNamara, regardless of whether Representative Scott actually read the language before she told us what her position was on the bill, I don't know if she's read the language yet, quite frankly. But Representative McNamara has already said that this makes a change. Whether it's a good change or not, Representative McNamara seems to want to argue the substance of it. The fact of the matter is, it makes a change to an area that is in the jurisdiction of Representative Scott's committee. This should go to Representative Scott's committee, as we've already unanimously voted to do. In fact, we probably could have had the hearing in the time that we've had this discussion on the floor. So members, let's do the right thing. Let's vote no on this motion, get it to Representative Scott's committee for tomorrow morning, which she told the public that she was going to have a hearing on this tomorrow morning, and we can get this bill moved through the process and get done with our work. But there's no reason right now to skip this committee. Vote no.
Further discussion? The lady from Hennepin, Leader Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I just wanted to point out something I said earlier to Representative Thiessen. Representative Thiessen, regarding rules, if you would check Rule 2.03 in the joint rules, it says that when a committee in either house acts favorably on a bill, it needs to be referred to the Committee on Rules and Legislative Administration. In this instance, there was no action taken, so that's why it does not need to go to rules.
Further discussion? The clerk will take the roll. Members, please vote. The clerk will close the roll. There being 71 ayes and 59 ayes, the motion prevails. Announcements.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, the Committee on Ways and Means will meet at 1 o'clock in room 200 to take up the budget resolution. However, after having done that, we will recess until 7 o'clock and take up the higher education and public safety bills, also in room 200.
Announcements. The gentleman from Chisago, Representative Barrett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, the House Taxes Committee will meet 15 minutes after session in room 10. House Taxes, 15 minutes after session, room 10. Thank you.
Further announcements. The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Quick question, if Representative Knobloch will yield?
Representative Knobloch will yield. Leader Thiessen.
Thank you. Representative Knobloch, could you just tell the body what the changes are to the budget resolution, since not everybody is in Ways and Means?
The gentleman from Sherburne, Representative Knobloch.
Mr. Speaker, Representative Thiessen, We are proposing to increase the allocation to the Health and Human Services Committee by approximately $140 million. It's 139.6 million, something like that. I don't remember the exact number. And we're proposing to increase the allocation for higher education by, again, I don't remember the exact number, but somewhere between $3 and $4 million.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And would the majority leader yield? I just want to get a sense of what's coming the rest of the week.
The majority leader will yield. Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, as I understand, well, I know we have transportation omnibus on the floor tomorrow. It sounds like we're going to come in at 9 and recess for caucus, and then come back and deal with that. And on Wednesday we have the jobs bill. Do we know what's coming on Thursday, Friday? And I'm also heard we're coming in on Saturday. So I just want to, for people's scheduling purposes, want to understand what we're going to be hearing those days and whether we in fact will be in on Saturday.
The representative from Hennepin, Leader Pepin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and Representative Thiessen. You are correct. We will be taking up transportation tomorrow. We'll be taking jobs and energy on Wednesday. You can expect that we'll be taking a few other omnibus bills up this week. As I had mentioned earlier, we are trying to work the way through the process of the omnibus bills, primarily in April, so we can be looking forward to a few more bills this week.
The gentleman from Hennepin, Leader Thiessen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, as soon as we know what those bills are, that would be helpful for us to know, and also to know if we're going to be here on Saturday so people can plan. One other question, if the majority leader will yield.
She will yield. Leader Thiessen.
Thank you. We passed the avian flu bill on Thursday. I understand it went to the Senate, and there may be some changes being made to it. Do you know if it's going to be amended and then come back for our concurrence? Do you know what the schedule is on that avian flu bill at this point?
The lady from Hennepin, Majority Leader Pepin.
That is my understanding, that that we will be getting a concurrence. I have not heard of the schedule on that, however.
The gentleman from Hennepin. Announcements. Majority Leader Pepin.
I move that the House do now adjourn.
Representative Pepin moves that the House do now adjourn. All those in favor say aye. Opposed say no. The motion prevails and the House stands in adjournment until 9 a.m. Tuesday, April 21st, 2015.